That's the key word, scaling up. Let me come back to the audience now at this point. And if you'd like to make comments, questions, and I would like to request you to be as succinct as our panelists have been. We will have mics, and I will ask you, please tell us who you are. I see the first name, John, and then next to him is Howdy. And maybe we take this side of the room, 3 or 4 questions, comments. John.
Great, thank you. I'm John Coonrod with the Hunger Project. I'm particularly interested in this challenge of mobilizing all actors and all civil society. And my suspicion is that if we look at some successful stories where that's been done before, such as with vaccination campaigns, that kind of whole of society success typically happens at the district level. And there are probably about 2,000 districts where groups of organizations need to get together. And I'm just wondering how, through perhaps the convening power of the UN system or otherwise, we could really start to demonstrate district level mobilization, because that's an awful lot of civil society and private sector doesn't extend beyond a district.
You pass the mic next to Howdy.
Howdy Buis from IFPRI and Harvest Plus. I'll put on my IFPRI hat. I'll talk about food prices. When we hear about food price spikes, we think it's really cereal price spikes that gets people's attention. But for example, non-staple food prices in India have risen steadily by 50% over the past 30 years, and it happens in a lot of countries. Is that part of the problem? Do we have to solve that to get to zero hunger? And how do we do it?
You? People are very shy. Okay, Schengen.
Thank you for giving me another chance. Now, we know that the communities are sort of powered to take this on. The NGOs is also very excited about this initiative. The donors are very interested. International organizations are supporting this. I'm wondering, what about the country? Have any country also committed to end hunger? I know that Brazil did it. Some Latin American countries have done it. Has any African countries done the same thing? We are sort of very ambitious. We wanted to end hunger or malnutrition by a certain period of time. That's one, I think, particularly Richard and others. The second is the rights approach, the accountability. Yes, if we wanted to make sure that access to food is right, how can we ensure the rights to everybody? India introduced legislation. How can we make sure that every country put that in their law legislation? The third is the data. You mentioned about we're improving the data. Who is going to connect the data? Who is going to do this, track and monitor this? If we do not have good data, if we do not have indicators, how do we know we have ended hunger? Or how do we know we are on track?
Thank you, Schengen. Let me turn over to the panel. A number of different questions and comments. Sam, do you want to start off?
Right. In no particular order, I think the point of food price spikes, we tend to talk about food, immediately go to rural farmers when the majority of the people who are hungry are living in urban areas. So there's a direct correlation. You're going to have to deal with this in some way. I think the point on mobilizing, I think there's a challenge here for the states and civil society, because I think there's a tendency of civil society to spend its time critiquing the state, and a tendency of the states, countries, to view civil society as sort of slightly dangerous people over there. But I think the challenge is, can you create a dialogue around doing something? And I think this gets to this issue of commitments by states. I think there's a hesitance to do that unless there's some clear roadmap of how we're going to get there. So the issue of creating roadmaps that involve the private sector, civil society, and countries in doing this. And I think the last point on data, to me, this has been a central effort of our work that we're doing on the post-2015 agenda, is there has to be this data revolution that is at the heart of our ability to measure progress in this area. And that, again, is an issue both of political will and a recognition that the current data is inadequate.
Anybody else wants to come in? Jomo?
Yes, if I may. Thank you very much for these very interesting questions. I think given the constraints on the UN system and the very difficult situation in terms of the budgets which many governments face, I think it will be very difficult for the UN system to play a significant role in convening, especially at the local level. Also, it is very important that such convening has its roots on the ground in the national, preferably in the local context. And we have seen in many communities such initiatives being taken. And with very, very, very good consequences. You have, for example, if I may cite the example of Brazil, communities which commit to feeding children in school, and they in turn procure the food from local farmers. The local farmers in turn have a guaranteed market, so they produce the nutritious food which is specified by the dietitians for the school feeding programs. And whereas previously the farmers may be reluctant to produce those foods because of uncertainties of markets and so on and so forth. So you actually have a very virtuous cycle operating at the local level through these different programs. And so what is essentially starts off as a sort of social protection program, a school feeding program, actually stimulates farm production and farm production of a particularly nutritious type, and so on. So I think that really has to have its roots very much on the ground. The question of non-cereal food prices, which was raised, is very, very important because much of the problem of hidden hunger has to do with the non-cereal foods. And we find that poor people especially switch between different types of foods, partly because of price. And this becomes a very important, so if you have these non-cereal foods increasing in price, it becomes a very major deterrent from having nutritious foods. The question of what can be done what has been done in countries. Last year, the FAO honored and identified and honored over 40 countries for having achieved the MDG 1C target ahead of time. Okay? There were fewer countries which qualified for the World Food Summit's more ambitious goal of halving the number of hungry people. The MDG 1C is to halve the proportion of hungry people, but with the number of hungry people, a fewer countries, but it was well over 20 countries, almost close to 30 countries which qualified. This very simple acknowledgement is actually taken quite very seriously, and it reinforces the sense of commitment that commitment is being recognized and appreciated. Many of you know that former Ghanaian President John Kufuor has been appointed one of the co-president of the Conference on Climate in September this year. Kufuor was probably made the greatest progress in terms of halving hunger in Ghana at a fairly early stage, together with other achievements. But unfortunately, in many of these successful stories, hunger in terms of dietary energy, there was a significant progress in that regard. But there was much more modest progress, I have to emphasize, as you correctly pointed out, Schengen, in terms of reducing hidden hunger, in terms of micronutrient deficiencies. And this, unfortunately, is very regrettable. The question of rights becomes extremely important. Even with the higher food prices, the fact of the matter is that there is enough food being produced today, at least in terms of cereals, to feed everybody. The problem is that most of the 842 million we both talked about are people who, for various reasons, are not able to obtain access, either because they do not have enough of an income, or they do not they do not produce the food themselves. And this, of course, is a problem. So the question of access is as important as the question of availability. And now that a great deal of land, for example, is being used for other purposes, it is very important to ensure that food availability is there by continuing to increase productivity. And productivity, of course, also enhances incomes, and incomes is very important in determining access. The data question is a very, very difficult question. We have historically, because of economic financing and other constraints, made estimates. The numbers which I was presenting earlier are basically estimates based on information which we have, which are called food balance sheets. And but this only tells us something about dietary energy hunger. It does not say anything about many of the other indicators. And that's why the only nutrition indicator we have in the MDGs is on wasting. Okay, we do not have enough information at a global level to say very much. But it would be a mistake to say that just because we do not have the information, we shouldn't be ambitious and have a target. Let me give you the example of maternal mortality. For years, the WHO was reporting 500,000 women were dying every year in childbirth or during pregnancy. And nobody said anything. And then somebody published a paper suggesting that these numbers were bogus, and eventually came up with their own figures, and the WHO came up with their own figures. It turns out the WHO had their own guesstimate, which was very close to the published figures. But they were reluctant to go with it because it is not on the basis of information which is comprehensive, and they were hence reluctant to do so. So I think it is very important that just because we are not able to measure certain things, we do not drop our ambitions in terms of tackling particular problems. But that having been said, it is also very important that we enhance accountability by trying to get better data on these very difficult to measure and track issues.
I just wanted to make 2 points. One point on data, which several have already have addressed them, but this alignment in terms of what we're tracking, what data we're collecting as a global community, and ensure that we're able to measure progress and impact not only in the long term but along critical milestones. So we are incorporating this element of real time as possible, so we can course correct and make some sound, timely decisions on policy, practice, and even funding streams where we need to go. The point, John, that you raised about district level mobilization, I think it lends itself to a bigger conversation of the role of unconventional players and unconventional actors who are not at the table, who really need to be at the table. And I'm sure Jomo will emphasize this as well, but from representing this independent initiative, we see the opportunity for the Zero Hunger Challenge to be highly participatory. We don't see this as driven by the UN or driven by a handful of government organizations. This is really a call to action for us to all join and bring our friends who aren't usually invited to the table to come to the table, from the private sector, from civil society, from the public sector, and at all levels.
Wonderful. We have a large online audience, and I've already gathered a number of questions and comments from them. I'd like to pose them at this time before I come back to the room audience. And I will ask our panelists, please, you do not need to respond to everything, but pick up on some of the key questions that you're hearing. And there are a number of them already, and I think Simone is going to bring some more already. First question is, what is each panelist's theory of change related to hunger? One can write a PhD on this, but it is an important thing because it frames how you think about this. Second question is, to what extent are you involving regional organizations in this initiative? For example, in the case of Latin America, PAHO or ICA. And I think this you've already addressed this question of bringing in the key players, but to put that on the table. Richard, there's two questions specifically addressed to you. First question is that research suggests that programs like Food for Peace are highly inefficient and grounded in the US's own farming lobby. What do you say to that, and how is Feed the Future going to be different? I am reading a question. The second question is also, food aid is inherently part of any response to food security and emergency responses. Do you see local, regional, and global markets playing a role in this, seeing that all the US food aid is currently American grown? Is it not true that our own American policies on food have to change? Next question is, urbanization is a growing issue, and how is the Zero Hunger Challenge addressing the key issues or factors affecting hunger, especially hidden hunger, in a rapidly urbanizing world? And this is an important question because it raises the context going forward. The last question is, in seeking to provide 100% access to adequate food all year round and in a sustainable way, is there a role for modern agricultural biotechnology, for example, in pest-resistant and drought-resistant crops? What would that role be, and how could it best be implemented? There's a number of key questions. I know there are people in the audience here who also want to ask. Ask our panelists, pick up on those questions that have not already been addressed, or those that you think are overarching, and please be very succinct this time. And I start, Nabiha, in this order. Pick up the ones that you think.
So on the biotech question, I think it comes down to leveraging the evidence and the fact that we are not going to feed the world without innovations in crop science and crop research. So I'm not going to criticize those who are anti-GMO, but I think we have to have a very realistic conversation, and we have to create the right evidence base so that policymakers understand that this is the way forward, this is the way it should be. If we want to ensure that we're not letting children starve, that mothers have plenty of food for their families and can prosper and progress, we need to leverage technology such as GMO, but also technology and innovation in a whole host of other spaces, and get them out into the field and support them vocally.
Wonderful, thank you. Sam?
So building on this, smallholder farmer is a key part of the theory of change. I think the other part really is just the link between hunger and poverty. And the reality that unless you deal with issues of safety nets in urban environments, you're not going to address that aspect of hunger. And this goes in addition to smallholder farmers. On food aid reform, it needs reforming. U.S. food aid policies need reforming. There needs to be greater local purchase. But the reality will be, just as previously mentioned, that food aid will be needed and will continue to be needed. Where that food comes from and where it's purchased should change in terms of U.S. policy. And I think the challenge among GMOs from civil society has been interesting to get our question around what is the science, where is it needed, where can it add value, who owns what, and what is its impact on the power dynamic within communities and villages. And that's a broader question than simply the science of greater production.
Jomo will take one more round of questions, a small reflection.
Yes, very quickly, on the regional front, last year was a very good year. Latin American and Caribbean community, known in Spanish as CELAC, agreed last year at the heads of governments level, committed themselves to zero hunger. African Union made a similar commitment at their meeting last year. In the Asia Pacific region, the ASCAP, the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific, also made a similar commitment, but not quite at the heads of governments level. So there has been progress at the regional level. On the question of biotechnology, I think the debate, obviously there is a clear role for biotechnology, but biotechnology is one, like the proverbial Indian elephant, it means different things to different people. And one of my colleagues, Peter Kenmore from California, he did very pioneering work showing that the elimination of the natural predators of the brown hopper, it's a kind of a grasshopper, but it's brown in color, had resulted in the proliferation of brown hoppers, which had destroyed rice crops. And the way, so basically a different type of integrated pest management system was born from that. And another thing which they pioneered from the 1980s was how farmers learn. So instead of the kind of agricultural extension work with a government extension worker or somebody from a private company coming to the farmers, farmers learned from each other by having facilitated learning experiences. And so I think there is a lot which we can learn, and the technology is not just a technology of the science, but also of the social relationships underlying technological difference. This is very important because unlike the Green Revolution of the 1960s, 70s, the current phase of technological innovation does not have the kind of facilitative drive which has been facilitated by governments in the past. And we need to find new ways of facilitating innovation.
And I come now to the last round, and I'll ask people to be very brief because we do want to end on time at 1:45. Where's the mic?
Hello, my name is Cecilia Gonzalez, and I work for an organization called World Relief. My question is, Nabiha mentioned the idea of coming as equals to the table, the need of working cross-culturally and bringing different actors of civil society. I'm a food scientist, and generally I don't find food scientists in this environment. But I also find that people, maybe we talk down to others, like, you know, the evil private sector or the agriculturalists that don't understand nutrition. How do we change our communication so that we can actually be able to come to the table as equals? And maybe what are you doing now that is really supporting that change?
Can you pass the mic on? Just the next hand. We are going to be efficient. I will come to that side of the room.
My name is Marcia Eccles. I'm a professor at Howard's Law School, where we have a World Food Law Institute. And our focus is usually international regulatory legal issues. But in teaching, students are very interested in the right to food. And if we're trying to encourage young lawyers to be interested in food law and regulation, that's one of the topics that we might focus on. Jomo, you mentioned that now we need to look at the right to food in a new way. And I wondered what some of those new aspects of right to food might be, especially from a legal and regulatory perspective. Our students this semester chose food deserts. It said that was an issue that really needs to be focused on here in the United States in particular, but elsewhere also. But are there any other issues that you or the other panelists might suggest considering?
Thank you. Let me come to that side of the room. Sunu to Sudhir, and then you come to the first row.
My name is Sudhir Vanmali. I work for ICF International. I have a question with regard to the 5 elements that were discussed earlier on in the presentation and we referred to in this Zero Hunger Challenge issue. When I look at these of zero stunted children or 100% access to food or food systems or increasing smallholder productivity by 100% and zero loss and waste of food, I believe that there are variety of infrastructures that are necessary for this superstructure to be built. And I do not think in the smallholder agricultural world or in the sub-Saharan African and sometimes South Asian smallholder agricultural world, the infrastructures exist. If they do, they are weak, and at worst, they are non-existent. So how do we raise this superstructure of 5 elements by not taking into consideration the infrastructures that don't exist? And what will we do in order to be able to address this particular major lacuna in our perception of these issues? Thank you.
Thank you, Sudhir. Can we bring the mic up to the 2 ladies? And please raise your hand so she can see. Yeah.
I'm Katie Proch with Leadership Africa USA, and I was just curious to see your take on the timeline that is proposed right now, because we all know that with increased conflicts in different countries, you have increased displaced people, breaking down of infrastructure, and so it's more difficult to supply other people with the food that they need. And so do we still think that we can maintain the same timeline, even taking into account different conflicts throughout the world?
Pass the mic. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Joan Dudick-Ayoso. I teach at George Washington University now, but I spent most of my career at USAID and State Department. I usually come to these seminars, which are wonderful, to know what has changed. And so my first comment would be that listening to what has been said, it is very hard for me to see anything different than what would have been said 30 years ago when I was working on Bangladesh and answering the same questions about food aid. So what I see, just listening to you, for whatever it's worth, of the value of this is the emphasis on mobilization, on partnership at the local level. But I haven't heard, aside from some brief discussions about technology, I haven't heard anything that we would do differently in terms of increasing production. I'm also worried that I haven't heard anything about infrastructure. And we can talk about incomes increasing, but we go back to the issue of how do you increase income. So I guess I don't know whether to be happy that there's this idea that we should mobilize, and maybe taking, let's say, drawing on the lessons of the MDGs, or if I should be unhappy because the solutions that we seem to have are solutions that we have been working on for years and years and years. So I know, because I've gotten 8 grandchildren now, that, I mean, we're educating, some of my students are in the room, we're educating a new crop of people who have to know the past in order to move to the future. But I am very worried that we seem to be sort of going around in circles with what are the remedies.
Thank you very much. Forgive me that we're not able to take more questions, comments, either from the room or online, but I'm sure there'll be a chance to engage. Before I come to the panelists, let me take the prerogative to one, make a commercial, and 2, ask a question. Resilience came up several times, and I have to make this commercial that we are organizing the 2020 conference on building resilience for food and nutrition security, May 15 to 17, Addis Ababa. Come and visit the website. But the question I want to ask you is also following very nicely from Joanne's plea. What do we not know that we still need to know to be able to actually make a major difference to achieve the Zero Hunger Challenge? Do we know everything, or is it that we don't know some things that we should invest in? Panelists, same rules as before. Pick up on the big things that you can and then have a chance to interact. These will be your closing comments also. Let me start in the order we began. Nabiha?
Great. So I'm going to address 2 of the questions from the audience. The first one from Cecilia on not talking down and how do we get some of these other participants at the table. And just putting my Community for Zero Hunger hat on, that is the intention of this, which kind of ties into the answer to your question as well, is bringing those other actors to the table and as equals, accounting for their perspectives, identifying potentially some of those specific solutions and answers that we may not have deployed at scale that directly link up to what is needed in the field, accounting for context-specific challenges. And you know, the Community for Zero Hunger is an open platform, so anyone and all can join and support and work with us over the next 24 months, and I welcome you and your colleagues to do that. Also, there was the comment on the right to food by our colleague, and I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. But, you know, Jomo mentioned that the right to food is one of the platforms, a significant platform for the Zero Hunger Challenge. And, you know, I think aside from, I don't even want to get into the legal ramifications of this. From my perspective, the right to food conversation or rights-based conversation is very much about an advocacy, empowering platform for communities, however you define a community. And it also forces us to have a very tough conversation about the process and how do we ensure that every man, woman, and child has the right to nutritious food at all times. But let it be known that a rallying cry requires an action plan, right? So if we are going to go down a rights-based or rights-focused approach for food security, for nutrition security, we have to be very deliberate about what that means and ensure that those who want to realize that right also have the tools and very actionable tools in place to make that happen. And I think that is something that we as a community need to ensure comes to the surface.
Well, let me end with an optimistic note, because I think as much as our community is working in Syria and conflicts around the world, we're seeing fewer conflicts around the world. But I think the basic message here is that the approach that the world is taking to the broader development enterprise is fundamentally different than it has been at any time in the last 30 years. And those differences are due to a wide range of factors. At least from our vantage point, a much more engaged, much more active local civil society, governments wanting greater ownership of their own process, the ability of technology and voice of people to, you can no longer, have people starve quietly and disappear in this world. The desire and recognition of partnerships and the concept that this is now a multi-stakeholder approach to solving these problems, the bringing in of new technologies, and a public mobilization that things can be done. We have not seen the reduction of infant mortality because there wasn't a belief it could be done. And I think some of the lessons that we've seen in driving some of the indicators on the health side can happen on this side as well. But the part of that is recognizing that it's not a sector by itself, but that this ultimately does fit under the broader MDGs and some important post-2015 frame that's yet to be created.
Very much. Jomo, the final word.
Yes, thank you. The opportunity to engage on the questions of right to food and particularly questions of law are really huge. There are so many issues which can be raised, particularly because of the variety of national and other constitutional and legal contexts, but also because of the trend over the last 2 or 3 decades towards globalization, the increasing influence of property rights, including intellectual property rights, questions of the agreement on agriculture and the restrictions which have been imposed on countries in terms of how they can subsidize the farmers, procurement prices for farmers, and so on and so forth. So I would see this as a huge opportunity for those who are legally inclined, and I'm very pleased to hear that there is a Food Law Institute at Howard University, and I wish you all well, and we'll be very happy to collaborate. One of my colleagues now in the Washington office, Barbara Eckwell, used to lead our Right to Food work in Rome, and she'll be happy to talk to you. If I may just quickly move to another issue, the question of what is new. I think that many things, our understanding of many issues have changed. I would be the first to admit that when I first engaged with nutrition issues as a student, I'm not a trained nutritionist by any means. In those days, we used to talk about protein malnutrition, kwashiorkor, marasmus, and so on and so forth. Today, nobody talks about that. The emphasis are quite different on the other micronutrient deficiencies and so on. Likewise, with the Green Revolution, if we look at what Norman Borlaug achieved, his achievements were largely with maize or corn as well as wheat. And of course, there was a parallel process going on in East Asia with rice. Many of the food crops which are so important to sub-Saharan Africa were relatively poorly researched, and there's so much to be done. And now we have the additional challenge of climate change, both climate change mitigation as well as climate change adaptation. Adapting to much lower water supplies, much reduced water supplies is a huge challenge, for example, for rice. The idea of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions in association with food production, not only cereal crop production, but also animal husbandry, again poses many challenges. We often hear that talk of no-till agriculture, but what does it mean if you do not have cheap herbicides available? How viable is it? And I would say that the research agenda for scientists continues to be huge, but you're quite right that many of the issues which we are talking about today have been enduring issues, reflective of the fact that we have not been able to make as much progress as the state of our knowledge should have allowed us to make. And that is the real challenge. But I'm very pleased that there is so much interest today and also in other audiences, and I am optimistic because we have seen in recent times a greater degree of interest, of public interest on the one hand, but also very importantly we have seen a greater level of political commitment, which we hope can be enabled to translate into much more progress than has been the case thus far. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank our online audience. I would like to thank the audience here in the room. And most importantly, I'd like you to join me in thanking our panelists for really helping us to think through and commit to a zero hunger world.